Hey guys, this is Tauna. Today we have a potentially controversial take. I don't know. We'll have to see as to what you guys think. I'm gonna, present my arguments, present, everything that I kind of have going on up in here, and you guys can decide for yourselves. This is to do with the Duskmourn precons, which are just coming out. We're like on the kind of verge of the full release. We've had the pre-release last week and everything, and I just wanted to kind of talk about them a little bit because I am starting to think that precons may be becoming a bit too powerful for newer players, or a bit more finely tuned, like too finely tuned, if that's going to make sense. Which potentially not, and I'm talking like newer players to the game, where you're still kind of wrapping your head around things, because you know there is a lot. There is a lot within Magic the Gathering to kind of wrap your head around, and kind of keep track of. But looking at like these new precons here from Duskmourn, I think there's even more to keep track of than previous ones. Maybe I'm going crazy, and you guys can let me know differently. But personally, I just think that some of these are very well tuned, very great, which don't get me wrong, that's really good for like the veteran players who want to pick it up and upgrade it or have had more experience with the game. But for a newer player, they're going to be quite overwhelming. Now, I'm 100% aware that, newer players jumping straight into Commander are going to potentially have issues. Commander is a more kind of complicated, obviously more casual, but also a more complicated kind of format than just playing a one-on-one 60 deck, a 60 card deck. All right, you've got a lot more to kind of keep track of between 4 different players. You've got like threat assessment, because you got to not just threat assess is on one person's board, but you got to start threat assessing between 3 other opponents as well, and not just what is out on their board as well, what's in their hands, how much mana they got open, everything like that. And I think that these newer decks becoming more finely tuned is really, really great for, the players who've been playing for a little bit, but it's kind of going to end up potentially leaving a bigger gap between that kind of starting out with the kind of 60 format, starting into Commander. And it's kind of that into Commander. I think that if you're getting into Commander, most people would say, hey, go pick up a precon, start with that. But if we've get to the point that all our precons are very finely tuned, then we're going to have more issues with them. Now, there's obviously some easy solutions for this, which I'll talk about a bit later on as well. But we'll go through kind of the decks and stuff. Before we get into it, though, make sure you guys subscribe. We're on our road to hit 10,000 subscribers. One more person literally subscribed as we're talking about this. We're trying to hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year. That is, 2 months to 3 months roughly to go. And if we can if we get 1,000 subscribers every month, then that's roughly what we're kind of doing. And we've been going there. Like, I think in the last month, like start of September, we had 4,800. We've got 1.5k this month, so that's really great. All right, so let's start off with the Death Toll one, because I think the Death Toll one is probably the most simple from the new precons. So I have put in a filter that kind of filters it down to just triggers, right? Because the triggers are the things that are going to be a bit more complicated, I think, and a lot more to kind of keep track of. And it's also the area where I think that they started to kind of, more finely tune, bring the decks together a bit better and everything. Now, again, I will say that that is a great thing. It is a great thing to have that. But it is going to create some more kind of complications. So on top of winter, for a start with, winter is a bit more complicated. So last night I headed down to Melbourne to the Duskmourn launch event. I got invited down there as a VIP, and I was playing in a pod with 4 different people who have all played Magic before and everything. And even with this card here, it was still like took a bit to kind of explain it because of the section down here about like the card types, and you got exile card type, exile cards, and then if you've got 4 or more card types among those, then you can bring something back and stuff. It was just a more complicated kind of thing. That's like just the face commander. It just took a bit kind of between the card types and stuff, because that's not a insanely kind of straightforward thing, especially when you first look at it. People like, say, oh, I need to exile 4 cards and they all need to be different types and stuff. But no, technically you could get away with just exiling potentially as low as like 2 cards. If you exile like a Haywire Might and a enchantment land, that's 4 types between those two. So you can get away with it. Now, having looked through the actual deck here, it's not as bad. There is a lot to kind of keep track of, though, especially when you start looking into Delirium, because you got to keep track of how many card types are within your graveyard. The other thing is that with Winter, you got to keep track of, you got to really kind of fine tune as to what you're exiling from your graveyard, because if you breach Delirium or break your Delirium, you don't have Delirium anymore, then it's going to shut down parts of your deck and stuff. Overall, this one isn't quite as bad because most of the kind of triggers were on ETB or when they die. Those ones are fine, and they're not too complicated in my opinion. If it's an ETB or something, then it's not too complicated. It's when you get into things that are like, when you do this, this. And then when you do this, it's doing this and this. So the worst one for that we'll talk about in a bit. So overall, this one wasn't quite as bad, the Death Toll one. I think the Death Toll one is more in line with a Precon that I would say isn't too bad for a newer player. Except for, when it comes to Winter, because of the fact that Winter is a little bit harder to kind of wrap your head around. But once you kind of wrap your head around, it's not too bad. So the Death Toll one is kind of not an example of this. But once we get into like the Endless Punishment one, the Endless Punishment one is very heavily around punishing people for doing anything, right? You're punishing people for drawing. You're punishing people for, their creatures dying. You're punishing people for everything. So once you kind of get into this, you are going to have a lot of triggers on the board, and you got to keep track of what is on your board and then what your opponents are doing. So if your opponent's drawing a card, then you've got to go, look, this has triggered this. Now, someone in my previous video complained about me using the word procs. I apologize. It's just kind of, left over from me playing MMOs. I'll try and use triggers from now on, just because I think that's easier. But when you kind of get down, like, obviously, that's the proper term. So the Endless Punishment one here, you've got like just so many different cards that you've got to keep track of what your opponent's doing and be like, okay, so you've drawn a card, now you're going to trigger this and this. You've sacrificed, that's going to trigger that. You cast a spell, let's have a look at what that's triggering. And it's going to be something that for a newer player, you're going to miss things, right? As I said, ETBs aren't too bad, or, leave the battlefield effects aren't too bad. They're something that's pretty easy to keep track of. Even the things that are at the beginning of each upkeep are pretty easy to keep track of. But when it comes down to like the Lord of Pain, for example, I was playing with Casa last night at the event, and he was playing this deck with the Lord of Pain. But if you tune out for like just 1 second, you'll miss someone playing a card on their turn, or on someone else's turn, especially because this isn't just the first spell they cast on their turn, it's on other people's turns as well. So you're going to potentially kind of just miss triggers all over the place, which is something that's going to end up feeling bad. Now, most people will be like, hey, you can take that back. And I offered that to Casa a few times. Hey, yeah, not take it back. Hey, you can do that if you want and stuff. But it's just going to be something where you just have to keep like super track of it, especially once you start building up a bigger board, once you've got some of these enchantments in there as well. And, you've got like triggers on, like you've got someone cast a spell. Oh, look, you've got this trigger, and there's like one other one that triggers, the Gleeful Arsonist triggers as well. So it's just more and more to kind of keep track of. And then you've also got to like be like, hey, because you did this, got to do this. So you got to keep doing that to people over and over again. Now that's just kind of the way the deck works, right? Like that's just how a group slug deck works. You're punishing people for doing the stuff that they have to do and everything. But it's just going to be more difficult for newer players, in my opinion. Again, this is talking about newer players. For veterans or, people who have been playing the game for a while, it's not going to be quite as bad. But even then, it might get a bit overwhelming. Next one here is the Jumpscare one. So I'm super apologize if the guy who played this watches this video. I can't remember your name, sorry. But the guy with the other guy in our pod who was playing Duskmourn, there's just so much going on with this that it's just a lot to kind of keep track of. Most of this is landfall, which isn't quite as bad, right? Like landfall, it's just, hey, I'm playing a land that's going to trigger these 3 things that I've put over here with triggers. One that we did have trouble with Kian. That was trouble to kind of keep track of because it's hard to remember, hey, she's even, you can do this. Hey, she's odd, you can do that. It was just a little bit to kind of, be like on top of that kind of thing. But it was like when he draws a card, when he'd play a land, he'd manifest dread, and then the manifest dread would trigger the Trail of Mystery. He searches up a land, puts that into his hand. Then he had another thing that was like, oh, now I can play a land because of this, which was, I think he had AC out at the time, so he could play land with AC. Then he's got to flip something, and then there's just a lot of different things with this one. It wasn't quite as bad because it was mostly just landfall, right? Like mostly just kind of going around that landfall. But some of the things that were like, when a manifest dread, when a permanent's turned up, when when you look at someone the wrong way, you do this. Was a little bit kind of more kind of going on, which was, just a bit more to kind of keep track of than I would expect for a newer player to be able to kind of wrap their head around immediately. The last one here is the Miracle Worker one, and this is the one that kind of made me think about making this video. This is the one that I played last night. It was a very fun deck and very enjoyable, but I missed so many different triggers. Now, that could also be just because I'm not used to the deck, right? I'm not going to say that, I'm a super duper veteran player or anything like that. I have been playing the game for quite a while, though, so you'd think that I'd be able to do it. But with this deck, it is around like surveilling the top of your deck. So that's already kind of a more complicated mechanic because that's something that a newer player's got to figure out what they want to do with things. It's just going to take a little bit for them to be able to kind of wrap their head around. But then once you got the miracle thing, right? So miracle is not just on your turn. It's the first card you draw on each turn. So we had, I was playing, and then next to me was Casa playing the Endless Punishment deck, and he had out the Storm Fist Crusader, which allowed me to draw a card. So then I needed to make sure that I was keeping mana up and then potentially miracle out whatever I drew on his turn as well. Very fun, but also a lot to kind of keep track of. But the thing that was kind of got a bit overwhelming at one stage, and I felt like I was just kind of sitting there playing solitaire, was once you start getting into all these kind of constellation and eerie triggers, right? I've got Constellation Eerie's. Every time an enchantment enters, I got to trigger this. I had like, what was it? I had Messer Enchantress out. I had Doomwake Giant, Fear of Paralysis. I had we had Monologue Tax out, Sigil of the Empty Throne, Shark Typhoon. Yeah, you could kind of see there was just a lot of what this one here, Dusty Parlor. I had that room open as well. There was just kind of a lot to kind of keep track of every time an enchantment entered. Even then, it's not when an enchantment enters necessarily. Some of it's also whenever you cast an enchantment. So I've got to I'm casting the enchantment, so that's going to trigger these ones, and then the enchantment enters, and then it's going to trigger these ones, and then it's just kind of what I'm kind of getting at is there's just so much to kind of keep track of that for a newer player, I'm not sure that I could be like, hey, yeah, this is a good deck for you. You should definitely kind of look into this deck. It's for a newer player. For most of my guides that I suggest things for, I'm expecting you have had, probably about 6 months Magic experience under your belt, like my top 10 guides. That's what I'm like, you've got a handle on the game already. But it's kind of, just kind of a lot. Especially this Fear of Sleep Paralysis. That was another thing that we had in there. So the Fear of Sleep Paralysis, it has Eerie, and then whenever it or another enchantment enters, I can tap a creature and put a stun counter on it. Stun counters can't be removed from permanents your opponents control, so therefore they can't untap. So that was one thing that kind of, it took a bit to explain as to what the stun counters are. They prevent permanents from untapping, but they get removed at the start of the upkeep. They get removed at the start of the upkeep, and then it doesn't untap that upkeep when it has 0. It's got to wait till the next one. So I had tapped down the dude who was playing Death Toll. I tapped down a whole bunch of his stuff with it. So then his stuff, he removed all the stun counters, and he's like, "Oh, do they untap now?" I'm like, "Not yet. Like, you got to wait another turn until they got to be able to untap." Which I think enabled him. I know he did end up winning from it, I believe. But yeah, it was a bit painful. Like, there's just so much to kind of keep track of with the deck, is what I'm kind of getting at here. Now, again, I'm not saying, you know, if you're a veteran player, don't pick up any of the sorry, if you're a new player, don't pick up any of these. Just expect them to be more complicated, a lot to kind of start wrapping your head around. I would 100% suggest you read through all the cards and kind of get a grasp on what the cards are doing before you start playing, which I don't need to necessarily suggest for every precon. Like, if I'm having a look in here at the like previous precons, like say for the example, Animated Army. Let me just copy paste my thing from here. If we have a look at Animated Army, I don't think I need to kind of suggest that someone go through and read every single thing that is happening here. I think that it is relatively kind of straightforward. Most of it is just when things enter, or when you pass things, which is simple enough. It's not something that, you know, I need to kind of suggest or anything. Peace Offering is more veteran, and a bit harder. Family Matters or Screw It Away, I think that both of those are relatively straightforward, and not as many kind of trigger here, trigger here, trigger here, trigger here kind of things. Screw It Away is a little bit more like that, just because it does have stuff when you create tokens, then you create tokens, but otherwise it's relatively kind of straightforward. So I guess that's just what I kind of wanted to bring up. Whether people agree with me or not, let me know down below. I'm 100% willing to be wrong, and maybe it was just, you know, yeah, maybe it's just my brain fatigue or something, but I just felt like when I was playing this, I could wrap my head around it, but I could 100% understand why for a newer player it would be a bit more difficult. Now, as for what the solution is here, in my opinion, it is making starter precons. Again, like, we do have starter ones. If I can find them. Starter commander decks. We do have these, but I think that at this stage, they're a little harder to find, or at least over here in Australia, I think they were harder to find. As well as the fact that when they came out, I don't think that they were incredibly kind of put together as well, right? I think that nowadays, like, a starter precons that are up to kind of the stage of these ones, but not with the difficulty, if that makes sense. Like, you know, really good, but relatively kind of straightforward is what I'm trying to talk about here. I just think that it's something that would be kind of great to kind of see, or even like just a new set of starter precons that are designed for new players, or like, you know, if you release a set of 4 commander precons, then have one of them be like or like just have one of them be like a relatively straightforward, easy one. But I'd love to hear from you guys as to what you think. Have a great day and goodbye.